The box arrived on a Tuesday, carried in by the second footman with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to remark upon the things that passed through his hands in this house. It was large, too large for gloves, too flat for a hat, and wrapped in paper the color of clotted cream, tied with cord rather than ribbon. No card sat upon it, no name marked the lid. Rosalind Selwyn, Duchess of Aldbury, was alone in the morning room when it was brought to her. She had been writing letters at the small desk beneath the window, the one she preferred because it caught the eastern light and because it was the farthest seat in the house from her husband's study. She set down her pen and regarded the box for a long moment before she untied the cord. The tissue paper inside was layered with the precision of someone who understood presentation as a weapon. Rosalind folded it back with steady fingers and saw the silk. It was red, not the quiet garnet of an evening gown, not the faded rose of a morning dress. This was a red that burned, deep, arterial, the color of something alive and recently opened. The silk had a weight to it that spoke of expense, and the cut, when she lifted the bodice free, was exquisite. Empire waist, as was proper, with a neckline that sat precisely at the edge of what propriety would tolerate. Sleeves that ended just below the elbow, trimmed with lace so fine it might have been spun from cobwebs. It was a magnificent dress. It was also, for the christening of Lord Fanshaw's daughter on Saturday, an act of war. Rosalind understood this immediately. One did not wear red to a christening. One wore white or cream or the palest blue, colors that deferred to the infant, to the sacrament, to the solemnity of the occasion. A woman who arrived at a christening in red silk would draw every eye in the chapel and hold them there. She would become the subject of the afternoon. She would be whispered about for weeks. The dress had not come from a modiste. Rosalind recognized the hand behind it the way one recognizes a familiar perfume in a room that should not contain it, not through evidence, but through the particular quality of cruelty that accompanied it. Lady Venetia Carr did not leave cards, because Lady Venetia Carr did not need to. She had spent the better part of 18 months making herself understood without ever once committing her name to paper. Rosalind laid the dress across the settee and smoothed the silk with the flat of her palm. Then she returned to her letters. She did not mention the dress to her husband at dinner that evening. This was not unusual. She mentioned very little to Julian Selwyn anymore, and he, in turn, mentioned very little to her. Their meals had acquired the careful choreography of two people who had learned to occupy the same room without occupying the same silence. He spoke of the estate when something required her attention, a tenant's roof, a boundary dispute, the draining of the lower field. She spoke of the household when something required his, a chimney that needed repointing, a request from the vicar's wife for the use of the east meadow. Between these functional exchanges lay a vast and carpeted emptiness that neither of them had named. It had not always been so. Rosalind could remember, though she tried not to, the first weeks of their marriage, when Julian had looked at her across the breakfast table with something approaching curiosity. She was the youngest daughter of Sir Lawrence Hale, possessed of good teeth, a passable dowry, and the kind of composure that older women described as breeding and younger women described as coldness. Julian had chosen her, or rather his solicitor had chosen her, from a field of candidates whose primary qualification was an absence of complication. He wanted a wife who would manage the household, appear at the necessary dinners, and refrain from making herself interesting. Rosalind had fulfilled this brief admirably. She had overseen Aldbury through the steward, Ogden, with quiet competence. She had redecorated the blue drawing room. She had learned the names of every tenant farmer's wife and every tenant farmer's eldest child, and she had remembered them, which was the part that mattered. She had done everything that was asked of her and nothing that was not, and Julian had rewarded this diligence by losing interest in her entirely within the first autumn. Lady Venetia Carr had appeared with the first frost, or rather had reappeared, because Rosalind later understood that Venetia had been there before the marriage, and during it, and that the brief interlude of the wedding and the honeymoon had been exactly that, an interlude. Venetia was a widow of independent means, sharp-featured and precise, the sort of woman who entered a room the way a blade enters a sheath, with the understanding that the space had been made for her. She and Julian were seen together at the opera. They were seen together at Tattersall's. They were not seen together at Aldbury because Julian maintained at least that boundary, but Rosalind knew, as wives in these arrangements always knew, that the boundary existed for propriety's sake and not for hers. She had never confronted him. She was not certain what a confrontation would achieve, and she mistrusted actions taken without a clear understanding of their consequences. Julian was not cruel. He was simply absent, present in the house, present at the table, present in the pew on Sundays, but absent in every way that could not be measured by proximity. Rosalind had adjusted to this absence the way one adjusts to a draft in an old house, not by fixing it, but by learning which rooms to avoid. Now she sat at her dressing table on Saturday morning with the red dress hanging from the wardrobe door, and Mrs. Pruitt standing behind her with a look that suggested she had something to say and the professional restraint not to say it. "Will you be wearing the gray muslin, Your Grace?" Mrs. Pruitt asked, reaching for the dress that had been laid out the previous evening. It was exactly the sort of dress one wore to a christening, high-necked, demure, the color of morning fog. "No," Rosalind said, "the red." Mrs. Pruitt's hands paused in the air above the gray muslin. She looked at the red dress hanging from the wardrobe. She looked at Rosalind's reflection in the glass. Whatever she saw there, and Mrs. Pruitt was a woman who had served 3 duchesses and had learned to read faces the way a sailor reads weather. She did not argue. "Very well, Your Grace." The dressing took longer than usual, because the red silk required different stays and a different chemise, and because Rosalind asked for her mother's pearl earrings, which had not been worn since the previous season. Mrs. Pruitt dressed her hair simply, swept up and pinned with 2 tortoiseshell combs, because the dress did not require elaboration. It made its own argument. When Rosalind stood and turned to the glass, she saw what the room at the christening would see: a duchess in a dress that no duchess should wear to such an occasion, with an expression so composed it bordered on serenity. The red silk caught the light from the window and held it, glowing against her skin like embers banked in a grate. Mrs. Pruitt handed her gloves without a word. Julian was waiting in the entrance hall when Rosalind descended the staircase. He was dressed for the christening in a dark blue tailcoat with a cream waistcoat, his cravat tied with the mathematical precision that his valet applied to all things. He was examining his pocket watch when she appeared at the top of the stairs, and he closed it and looked up, and for the space of 2 heartbeats he said nothing. Then, "You are wearing red." "Yes," Rosalind said, reaching the bottom step. He studied her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not anger. It was not concern. It sat somewhere between recognition and unease, as though he had opened a familiar book and found the pages rearranged. "To a christening," he said. "The carriage is ready, I believe," Rosalind replied, and walked past him to the door. The ride to St. Crispin's was conducted in silence. Julian sat opposite her, which was their custom, and his gaze moved from the window to her dress and back to the window with the regularity of a man performing calculations he could not complete. Rosalind watched the hedgerows pass and kept her hands folded in her lap. St. Crispin's stood at the edge of the village, a Norman church with a squat tower and windows that had survived 2 centuries of indifferent glaziers. The Fanshawe christening had drawn the better part of the county, Lord Fanshawe being well-liked and his wife being well-connected, and carriages lined the lane for a quarter-mile in each direction. Rosalind could see Lady Ashton's barouche and the Countess of Bracknell's landau, and, drawn slightly apart from the others as though it preferred its own company, the neat black curricle that belonged to Lady Venetia Carr. She did not allow her gaze to linger on it. Julian handed her down from the carriage with the mechanical courtesy he applied to all physical contact between them. His hand was firm beneath her elbow, and he released it the moment her foot touched the gravel, and the withdrawal was so practiced that it no longer registered as a withdrawal at all. It was simply the way things were. They entered the church together, the heads turned. Rosalind had expected this, had in fact relied upon it, and she received the turning heads the way she received everything, with her chin level and her expression undisturbed. The red silk moved against her body as she walked, catching light from the windows, and the whispers that followed her up the aisle had the quality of wind moving through dry grass, constant, directionless, impossible to pin to any single source. Lady Fanshawe, seated in the front pew with the infant in a cascade of white lace, looked up as Rosalind approached, and her lips parted slightly. Behind her, the Countess of Bracknell leaned toward Mrs. Whitmore and said something behind her gloved hand. On the opposite side of the aisle, in the third pew from the front, Lady Venetia Carr sat with her back very straight and her face arranged into an expression of polite interest that did not quite conceal the sharp attention beneath it. Venetia had expected the dress to arrive and be worn in confusion, a woman who did not know what she was putting on, who would realize too late in the chapel, surrounded by witnesses, that she had been made a fool of. The dress was meant to announce Rosalind's ignorance to the world. She does not even know what is appropriate. She does not even understand what is being done to her. But the woman walking up the aisle of St. Crispin's did not look ignorant. She did not look confused or embarrassed or lost. She looked, Venetia realized, with a sensation that sat unpleasantly between admiration and alarm, deliberate. Rosalind took her place in the Aldbury pew. Julian sat beside her. She opened her prayer book. The christening proceeded. Reverend Lyle spoke the words with the gentle authority of a man who had baptized half the county's children and remembered each of them by name. The infant, a girl called Henrietta after Lord Fanshaw's mother, cried briefly when the water touched her forehead, and then settled into the particular silence of a baby who has decided to permit the proceedings. Lady Fanshawe wept, as mothers did. Lord Fanshawe stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder and his jaw set against the emotion that moved visibly through his face. Rosalind watched them. She watched the way Lord Fanshawe's thumb moved in small circles against his wife's collarbone, an unconscious gesture so private that observing it felt almost indecent. She watched the way Lady Fanshawe tilted her head back, just slightly, until it rested against her husband's waistcoat. These small adjustments, these tiny recalibrations of weight and warmth between two people who had learned to hold each other up. She did not look at Julian. She did not need to. She could feel his stillness beside her the way one feels the stillness of a held breath, taut, aware, waiting for something to release it. After the ceremony, the party moved to Fanshawe Hall for the reception. The dining room had been opened and a cold luncheon laid out, and the guests arranged themselves in the drawing room with glasses of champagne and the particular animation that follows a sacrament, louder than usual, brighter, as though the proximity to grace had given everyone permission to be festive. Rosalind stood near the window with a glass she had not drunk from and received compliments on the dress from women who did not mean them. Lady Ashton said it was striking. Mrs. Whitmore said it was bold. The Countess of Bracknell said nothing about the dress at all, but looked at Rosalind with an expression of frank assessment, as though she were revising an opinion she had held for some time. It was Lady Fanshawe who crossed the room with the baby and placed her in Rosalind's arms. "You must hold her," Lady Fanshawe said, with the particular generosity of a new mother who wishes to share her wonder. "She has been so good today. I think she rather enjoyed it." Rosalind took the child. The baby was warm and impossibly small and smelled of milk and the lavender water that had been used to wash her christening gown. She settled into the crook of Rosalind's arm with the absolute trust of a creature who has not yet learned that the world contains unreliable things, and Rosalind looked down at her and felt something move behind her breastbone that she had been keeping very carefully still. The red silk pooled around them both. Against the white lace of the christening gown, it looked like a declaration, though of what the room could not quite agree. Julian saw this from across the drawing room. He had been standing with Lord Fanshawe and Sir William Hatch, discussing something about the new drainage scheme that he would later be unable to recall when his gaze moved, as it had been moving all morning, against his will and against his habits, to his wife. She was holding the Fanshawe infant. She was standing in the window light, which fell across the red silk and turned it luminous, and the baby was curled against her chest, and her face, bent over the child, wore an expression he had never seen before. It was tenderness. But it was not the soft, yielding tenderness of a woman performing for an audience. It was a tenderness defended from every direction, fierce in its quietness, private in its depth, offered to this child who was not hers and might never have an equivalent who was. Julian went white. It happened all at once, the color draining from his face, as though something had been pulled from beneath him, some foundational understanding of his marriage and his wife and himself that had, until this moment, kept everything level. He set his glass down on the nearest surface without looking at it and heard it miss the table and shatter on the floor, but the sound reached him from a great distance as though it belonged to another room. He was not embarrassed by the dress. He had moved past the dress in the first minutes at the church, when he had watched his wife walk up the aisle and understood, in the wordless way that the body understands things the mind has not yet processed, that she had chosen it, not been tricked into it, chosen it, and that the choosing meant something he was not yet equipped to name. What undid him now was simpler and worse. It was the baby. It was the look on his wife's face when she held another woman's child. It was the understanding, arriving all at once like a window blown open in a storm, that Rosalind Selwyn had been standing in his house for 2 years with this capacity, this depth, this warmth, this fierce and guarded tenderness, and he had never once thought to look for it. Lady Venetia watched him from across the room. She saw the color leave his face. She saw the broken glass. She saw the direction of his gaze, and she understood, with the cold clarity that was her particular gift, that something had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. The dress had been her instrument. She had chosen it carefully, the shade, the cut, the timing. She had imagined Rosalind arriving at the christening in bewildered scarlet, drawing mockery, confirming what Venetia had always believed and what Julian had never contradicted, that the Duchess of Aldbury was a woman of limited imagination, married to a man who required more. Instead, the Duchess of Aldbury stood in the window light, holding a baby, wearing the red dress like armor, and the Duke of Aldbury was staring at her as though he had just discovered fire and was trying to remember if he had ever been warm before. Venetia set down her glass and left through the garden door. She walked across the terrace and down the gravel path to where her curricle waited, and she did not look back at the house or at the windows or at the drawing room where a woman in a red dress was holding a baby with an expression that had dismantled 18 months of careful positioning in the space of a single afternoon. No one remarked upon her departure. In the drawing room, her absence created less disturbance than a closed curtain. The carriage ride home was different from the carriage ride there. Julian sat in the same seat, opposite Rosalind, but his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of absence, the empty chair quality that had defined him for months. It was the stillness of a man holding himself together against the pressure of something he needed to say but did not yet know how to begin. Rosalind watched the hedgerows. She had returned the baby to Lady Fanshawe and received her compliments on the dress. "You do carry color beautifully, my dear. I never could." And she had curtsied to the vicar, and she had spoken briefly with Lord Fanshawe about the boundary elm that was the subject of some dispute with the parish, and through all of it she had maintained the composure that Mrs. Pruitt had witnessed that morning, and that the county had witnessed that afternoon, and that she herself had been maintaining, in various forms and to various degrees, for the duration of her marriage. She was very tired of it. "The dress," Julian said, breaking the silence so abruptly that the word seemed to startle even him. "Where did it come from?" "It was delivered on Tuesday," Rosalind said. "There was no card." She watched his face as the information arranged itself. She could see the precise moment he understood, a tightening around his mouth, a fractional movement of his jaw, as though he were biting down on something. "You knew," he said, "that it was not appropriate for a christening?" "Yes." "That is not what I meant." "I know what you meant," Rosalind said. "And yes, I knew." Julian looked at her. The failing light came through the carriage window and lay across the red silk in bands of gold and shadow, and in that light his wife's face was steady and clear and entirely without pretense. "Why did you wear it?" Rosalind considered the question. She considered the many answers she might give: defiance, strategy, indifference, pride, and discarded each of them because none was quite true, and she decided somewhere between the church and the carriage that she was finished with things that were not quite true. "Because I was not afraid of it," she said, and I wanted her to know that. The word "her" sat between them in the carriage like a stone dropped into still water. Julian did not ask who. He did not pretend. Whatever habits of evasion he had cultivated over the course of their marriage, they failed him now, stripped away by the image of his wife in the window light with another woman's baby, and the terrible clarifying understanding that the capacity for love he had been seeking elsewhere had been standing in his morning room for 2 years, writing letters by the eastern window. He did not speak again until they reached Aldbury. That evening, Julian sat in his study for a long time. Ogden came to the door twice with matters pertaining to the lower farm and was sent away both times. The fire burned down to embers, and Julian did not ring for it to be rebuilt. He sat in the leather chair with his hands on the armrests and looked at the portrait of his father above the mantelpiece, the third Duke, a man of decisive temperament and unexamined cruelties, and thought about inheritance. Not of land, not of title, the inheritance of inattention. The way a man could learn from the architecture of the house he grew up in that a wife was a fixture and not a person. That marriage was a settlement and not a living thing. He had learned this. He had enacted it faithfully. And the woman who had borne the cost of his education had worn a red dress to a christening and held a baby that was not hers with a tenderness that had broken something in him that he was not certain could be repaired. He wrote to Lady Venetia that night. The letter was 3 lines long. It contained no explanation and no apology, because Julian understood that explanations and apologies were currencies of intimate exchange, and whatever he and Venetia had shared, it had not been intimacy. It had been convenience dressed in candlelight. The response came the following morning, delivered to Ogden rather than to the house. Venetia was too intelligent to contest what she recognized as final. She departed for Bath within the week. By midsummer she had taken a house in Brighton, and by autumn she had married a baronet of comfortable means and unremarkable temperament, the sort of man who would not require her to compete with anyone for anything. Rosalind heard this through Mrs. Pruitt, who heard it through the housekeeper's network that connected every great house in the county like a telegraph that ran on tea and shortbread. She received the news without comment and turned back to her correspondence. In the weeks that followed, the county recalibrated. The Countess of Bracknell called at Aldbury for the first time in a year and sat with Rosalind in the drawing-room and spoke about her daughter's coming out, and neither of them mentioned the christening or the red dress or the curricle that no longer appeared at local gatherings. Lady Fanshawe sent a note thanking Rosalind for the silver cup she had given baby Henrietta, and added, in a postscript that managed to communicate a great deal while saying almost nothing, that she hoped to see both the Duke and Duchess at the Midsummer Assembly. Both. The word was underlined. The changes at Aldbury came slowly, because trust that has been neglected cannot be restored by declaration. Julian understood this, or was learning to understand it, which amounted to the same thing. He began with small adjustments. He took his breakfast in the morning room rather than the study. He asked Rosalind about the garden, not the functional questions he had asked before, about yields and planting schedules, but questions that required her to reveal what she preferred. Did she like the roses by the south wall? Had she chosen the lavender herself? Rosalind answered these questions with the caution of a woman who has been given reason to distrust gifts. She did not melt. She did not rush toward him with the eagerness of a wife who has been waiting to be noticed. She answered honestly and briefly, and then returned to whatever she had been doing, and Julian sat with the honesty and the brevity and understood that both were more than he deserved and exactly what he needed. He asked Mrs. Pruitt one afternoon when Rosalind was walking in the garden what his wife's days looked like. "Her Grace rises at 7, Mrs." Pruitt said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had been waiting for this question for 2 years. "She takes tea in the morning room. She reviews the household accounts with Ogden at 9. She writes letters until 11. She walks in the garden if the weather permits. She reads in the library after luncheon. She dines at 7. She retires at 10. It was the most ordered and the most solitary life Julian had ever heard described, and every hour of it had been arranged around his absence. Spring arrived. Julian accompanied Rosalind to the village for the first time in a year and watched the way the tenants' wives greeted her, not with deference alone, but with warmth, with the easy familiarity of women who knew her because she had made herself known to them, had remembered their children's names and their husbands' complaints and the particular difficulties of their particular lives. She had built something at Aldbury while he had been occupied elsewhere. She had built relationships, loyalties, a web of quiet attention that held the estate together in ways that Ogden's ledgers could not capture. He had not known. He had not asked. In June, Julian attended a session of the House of Lords for the first time that season. He sat through a debate on the corn laws and thought about grain prices, and thought about Rosalind, and found that the two subjects were not as separate as he had once believed. The estate was not an abstraction. It was the particular field that Rosalind had asked Ogden to drain. It was the particular tenant whose roof she had noticed needed mending. It was the particular garden she had planted with lavender, because she liked the scent of it in the evening, when the heat of the day released the oil from the leaves, and she sat on the stone bench and read by the last of the light. He came home from London a day earlier than expected, and found her on that bench, in a white muslin dress, with a book open on her lap and a cup of cold tea on the wall beside her. She looked up when she heard his step on the gravel, and for the first time in their marriage, she did not compose her face before he saw it. The expression she wore was unguarded, not joyful, not expectant, but open, in the way that a door is open when someone has decided to stop locking it. "You are home early," she said. "Yes," Julian said. And then, because he had been practicing this sentence for the length of the journey from London and still could not find a better version, "I should like to sit with you, if you would permit it." She moved her book to make room on the bench. It was not forgiveness. It was not even acceptance, not yet. It was space, offered carefully, without promise, the way one offers a hand to someone who has been standing too long alone. Julian sat beside her. The lavender smelled of evening and warm stone, and somewhere beyond the garden wall a blackbird was singing with the particular insistence of a creature that has found something worth repeating. By autumn, they walked the grounds together in the mornings. By winter, Julian moved his correspondence to the morning room desk, the smaller one beside hers, which had sat empty since the house was furnished. They did not speak of the red dress. They did not speak of Venetia. These subjects lay beneath the surface of their days like stones beneath clear water, visible, acknowledged, undisturbed. On a cold afternoon in February, Rosalind told him she was with child. She said it plainly, standing in the library with a hand resting on the back of the chair, and Julian looked at her and felt the same sensation he had felt in the Fanshawe's drawing room. The color draining, the ground shifting, the terrible and beautiful understanding that he was in the presence of something he had almost lost. "Are you well?" he asked, and was surprised to find that his voice was not steady. "I am," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt has already begun making preparations. She has opinions." Julian laughed. It was the first time Rosalind had heard him laugh in their house, and the sound of it, startled, genuine, unperformed, altered the room in a way she had not anticipated. It made the library feel inhabited. It made the marriage feel like something that was happening to both of them, rather than something that was happening to her alone. Their daughter was born in September. In the bedchamber that Rosalind had chosen for its eastern light, Mrs. Pruitt attended. The physician came from the village, and was quietly unnecessary, as Mrs. Pruitt had predicted. Julian waited in the corridor for 11 hours, and when Mrs. Pruitt opened the door and told him he had a daughter, he did not ask about the child first. He asked about Rosalind. They called her Frances, after no one in particular, a name chosen for its own sound, rather than for an obligation it was required to carry. She had Rosalind's eyes and Julian's jaw, and a temperament that Mrs. Pruitt described as decided, which was Mrs. Pruitt's way of saying that the child knew what she wanted and would make it known. 3 years later, the red dress still hung in Rosalind's wardrobe. She had not worn it again. She had not disposed of it either, and Julian, on the single occasion he had asked about it, had received an answer that he turned over in his mind for days afterward. "It is the most honest thing anyone has ever given me," she had said. "It told me exactly what was happening and assumed I would not understand. I should like to keep it as a reminder that I did." Julian had said nothing to this because there was nothing to say that would improve upon it. On the morning of Frances's 3rd birthday, Rosalind came downstairs to find that Julian had moved the small painting from his study, the landscape of the lake at Aldbury that his mother had commissioned and that he had kept above his desk since inheriting the estate, and hung it in the morning room, above the desk where Rosalind wrote her letters. She stood in front of it for a long time. Julian watched her from the doorway and did not announce himself, because he was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with the stumbling determination of a man who has wasted years and knows it, that the most important things he could offer his wife were not declarations, but adjustments. Small shifts in the architecture of their life that said, without requiring her to respond, "I see you. I see what you built while I was not looking. I would like to live in it with you." Mrs. Pruitt found the Duchess still standing before the painting when she came to discuss the arrangements for Frances's birthday tea. She noted the painting. She noted the expression on the Duchess's face. She said nothing about either, because Mrs. Pruitt had served 3 duchesses, and the lesson she had drawn from each was the same, that the truest things in a marriage are the ones that pass without commentary between 2 people who have learned, at last, to pay attention. They arrive here, like a dress worn without flinching, whenever they are ready.